Hello, my name is Fiona Denney and I am a Professor of Business Education at Brunel University London in the UK, and I'm delighted to do this podcast for the Journal of Higher Education Policy and Leadership Studies. I have published 2 articles in the journal looking at the concept of compassionate leadership in our higher education organisations, and shortly I will outline some of the key points in those articles. I have worked in the higher education sector in the UK for over 26 years now, in a variety of roles across a number of different universities. As someone who has been in leadership positions and also experienced the leadership of others firsthand, I have developed a research interest in understanding the challenges of those who enter into the leadership and management roles in academia. Previous research has focused on the career path of women progressing to the Pro-Vice-Chancellor level and the experiences of staff working through the recent pandemic period. Currently, I have a funded project which is examining the challenges and experiences of those in the academic head of department role, and I am always seeking to examine my empirical work with a lens looking at systemic and interpersonal compassion, or lack thereof, as I view this as being crucial for effective leadership now and into the future, more of which in a moment. My first article in the Journal of Higher Education Policy and Leadership Studies was entitled Compassion in Higher Education Leadership, Casualty or Companion During the Era of Coronavirus. In this, I was seeking to respond to evidence of a lack of compassion in universities at the time of COVID-19 that was surfacing in the media at the time. Lockdown started on the 23rd of March 2020 in the UK, and it was less than 2 weeks later that it was clear that many universities were responding to immediate pressures on finances through redundancy and cancellations of temporary contracts. On the 2nd of April 2020, David Batty, a Guardian journalist, wrote an article about 3 UK universities that were making staff on fixed-term contracts redundant, and around the same time, a movement started called the Corona Contract in response to this. The Corona Contract campaign lists dozens of universities which immediately started to get rid of graduate teaching assistants and temporary teachers, implementing hiring freezes, and proceeding with redundancies that were identified prior to the outbreak of COVID-19. Also somewhat more hidden from the more attention-grabbing headlines were the universities that were also suspending schemes such as those that were there to support the careers of early career researchers. This apparent lack of compassion for staff, particularly those on insecure contracts, contrasted sharply against the compassion that colleagues were demonstrating towards each other and their students, and also against compassion that was being enacted in our communities at large at the time, such as volunteer services being set up to support those who were shielding, the NHS and key workers being clapped on a Thursday evening, and the sheer generosity that was being shown towards the NHS frontline workers. In this article in the journal, I examine what this says about the role of compassion in our leadership in UK universities. Why were many of our leaders so quick to respond with redundancies? And why did compassion for university staff take an apparent back seat at this time? Compassion has been researched in the field of organisation studies, but only to a limited extent. And it is largely under-researched in leadership studies specifically, and greatly under-researched within the context of higher education, in spite of a burgeoning field of compassionate education and teaching. Compassion is defined by Warline, Dutton, Simpson and others in the field as being more than simply an emotion, as it involves taking action to alleviate the suffering, to some extent at least. In my first paper in the journal, I explore the toxic nature of working in universities and the increase in staff suffering from stress-related conditions and the importance of leadership noticing that suffering is occurring. Jason Canov identifies, however, that responding with compassion is insufficient if suffering itself can be prevented, and we should not allow our universities to continue with poor working practices and systemic inequalities which bake suffering into our structures and working lives. In my second article, entitled The Golden Braid Model, Courage, Compassion and Resilience in Higher Education Leadership, I decided to explore some of the elements that I believe weave together to make good leadership. Each of these three threads is discussed in order to develop a framework that could be used in development activities to support effective leadership for a new and uncertain world in academia. This paper builds on the previous one by highlighting the uncertain and chaotic macro environment for higher education even prior to the emergence of COVID-19. I make the point that the traditional model, where leadership has been conferred on those with a successful research background, is now less than ideal for the modern, uncertain and complex era that we find ourselves in. Traditional university leadership can be seen, therefore, as having originated from a technical model, that those in positions of authority needed specific technical knowledge, how to do research well, in order to lead those doing the same activities. But the higher education world has changed substantially, and this technical knowledge is no longer what is most needed now. Instead, I argue that we need a clear sense of values and principles which guide behaviours, regardless of what the circumstances are or how they might change in the future. Leadership is inherently difficult, complex and messy, and it is not usually what academics set out to do when they enter the academy, thus potentially also impacting on their own self-identity and stress. There has historically been little guidance on the route to the top, and it can be isolating once reached, as there is often little support for those in the senior roles. Existing models of leadership have largely been predicated on what has gone before, and what I was keen to do in this second article was to provoke thoughts and discussion in the higher education sector about how leadership can change to cope with the unpredictability we see around us. To this end, I propose that a new model of leadership would combine courage, compassion and resilience. In particular, I seek to make the case that resilience has become a misunderstood concept, linked with a suck-it-up mentality, not allowing for challenge when the system itself is punitive or at fault. Resilience in the literature is often focused on followers, and there is still relatively little guidance on how we can support our leaders to be more resilient, as well as courageous and compassionate. We need our leaders to address the systemic challenges that our higher education institutions are grappling with and are causing vast amounts of stress. This will require a great deal of courage, and it may also require resistance to some of the more pervasive factors in the macro environment that force an enduring focus on finances. Compassion is crucial in this battle. We have emerged from the COVID pandemic period battered, bruised and exhausted, only to be hit with economic, political and environmental traumas. In all of this, we need leaders who can be compassionate to help us all to move on with the courage and resilience necessary to build back better and stronger. I hope that you have found listening to this both interesting and challenging. I do not seek to imply that developing a different model of leadership will be easy. We have seen recently the resignation of Jacinda Ardern, someone lauded as being a compassionate leader, with her stating that she no longer has enough in the tank to do the job justice. Not only do our systems and structures not support compassion for staff, but they don't do a great job of supporting the resilience of compassionate leaders. And it is time that this was challenged. We need to redefine what leadership in universities should be about, and we need to work with our leaders to ensure support in both directions. Universities are full of very intelligent people, and we must be able to make this better for everyone. I would like, therefore, to leave you with the challenge to take forward these conversations in your university, and in particular, the question of how to make it a more compassionate environment for everyone. Thank you for listening.